Bold Enough to Win: How Confidence Changes What You Attempt, Achieve, and Become. An empowering audiobook by Enlight Audiobook about building the confidence to act boldly, overcome self-doubt, and become capable of more than you imagined. Introduction. A life can become smaller without making a single wrong turn. Sometimes all it takes is hesitation. An opportunity appears, but you wait. A difficult conversation needs to happen, but you hold back. A new ambition takes shape, but an inner voice quietly asks, "What if I fail?" Over time, these moments accumulate. Not because you lack talent or potential, but because uncertainty was allowed to make your decisions for you. Bold Enough to Win begins with a different idea. Confidence is not a personality trait reserved for the naturally fearless. It is a capacity you can build. True confidence does not mean believing you will always succeed. It means developing enough self-trust to move forward when success is not guaranteed. It is the conviction to speak when your voice may shake, the courage to begin before everything is perfectly prepared, and the resilience to continue when the first attempt falls short. Confidence changes more than how you feel. It changes what you attempt. What you attempt changes what you experience. What you experience changes what you believe you are capable of becoming. You do not need to become louder, tougher, or more impressive. You need to become less controlled by fear, less dependent on approval, and more willing to trust your own judgment. The real question is not, "Do I feel confident enough?" It is, "What would I attempt if I trusted myself a little more?" That question can change the direction of a life. Chapter 1. Stop waiting to feel ready. There is a strange kind of prison that has no walls, no locked doors, and no visible guards. It is built from phrases such as, "I'm not ready yet," "I need more experience," and "I'll start when the timing is right." From the outside, these statements sound reasonable. From the inside, they can quietly hold a person in the same place for years. We often assume confidence must come before action, as if courage were a feeling that suddenly arrives one morning and gives us permission to begin. But life rarely works that way. Confidence is usually built in reverse. You move first, discover what you're capable of handling, and then your belief in yourself begins to catch up. Before becoming one of the most influential figures in modern entertainment, Oprah Winfrey had already experienced circumstances that could have persuaded her to remain cautious for the rest of her life. Her early life involved poverty, instability, rejection, and painful experiences, yet she continued moving toward opportunities in broadcasting. When she began working in television, she did not possess the polished certainty people now associate with her career. She had to develop her voice while being watched, judged, and compared with others. Her early opportunities were not guarantees of success. They were openings that required her to step forward before she could know exactly where they would lead. Her eventual success did not come from discovering a magical moment when every insecurity disappeared. It came through accumulated experience. Each assignment, conversation, interview, setback, and opportunity gave her another piece of evidence that she could handle the next challenge. That is how confidence often works in real life. You do not manufacture certainty before moving. You earn it by moving. Consider how differently we behave when learning something new. A person learning to drive does not become confident by sitting in a parked car and repeatedly imagining perfect control. Confidence develops through starting the engine, making turns, braking too early, correcting mistakes, navigating traffic, and gradually discovering that the unfamiliar can become manageable. The same principle applies to almost everything that matters. A person who wants to become a better speaker must eventually speak. Someone who wants to become a leader must eventually make decisions before knowing exactly how everyone will respond. Someone who wants to build a business must eventually put an imperfect idea in front of another human being. Someone who wants a better career must eventually apply, ask, negotiate, or step into an opportunity that feels slightly beyond their current ability. Waiting until you feel completely prepared can become an elegant form of avoidance because preparation feels productive while protecting you from exposure. You can research another course, read another book, revise another plan, polish another presentation, or wait for a more convenient month. Meanwhile, the opportunity quietly moves on. This does not mean preparation is useless. Preparation matters, skill matters, judgment matters. But there is a point at which preparation stops improving your ability and starts protecting you from the possibility of failure. That is the moment when you need to step into uncertainty. The important distinction is between being unprepared and being unwilling to begin without guarantees. You should not enter a dangerous situation simply to prove that you are brave. You should not ignore useful knowledge or rush into decisions that require careful consideration. Confidence is not recklessness. It is the capacity to make a reasonable move despite incomplete certainty. The person who waits for absolute confidence is often waiting for information that can only be obtained through experience. You cannot know how you will perform under pressure until you have faced pressure. You cannot know whether you can lead until you take responsibility. You cannot discover your ability to recover from failure until something actually goes wrong. Experience becomes the laboratory in which self-trust is developed. This is why small actions matter more than they appear to. When you make a commitment and follow through, you create evidence. When you speak despite nervousness, you create evidence. When you ask a difficult question, survive an awkward moment, submit an application, receive a rejection, and try again, you create evidence. Gradually, your mind begins to register a new pattern. I can handle things I once avoided. That sentence is more powerful than temporary motivation because it is supported by experience. Confidence becomes credible when it has something behind it. You do not need to leap from complete doubt to absolute certainty. You only need to move far enough to create the next piece of evidence. Then move again. This is how you break through hesitation. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty before you act. It is to become capable of acting while uncertainty remains. There will always be another reason to delay. There will always be someone more experienced, a better time, a more polished version of your plan, or another skill you could acquire first. If you allow those conditions to become prerequisites for action, your life can become an endless rehearsal for a performance that never begins. At some point, you have to step onto the stage. You have to make the call, send the application, raise your hand, launch the project, express the opinion, or take the opportunity. You may not feel ready when you do it. That is not necessarily a warning sign. Sometimes it is simply the emotional sensation of entering territory where your current identity has not yet caught up with your ambition. The person you want to become is often waiting on the other side of an action your present self is afraid to take. So stop treating readiness as a permission slip. Prepare intelligently, assess the risks, learn what you need to learn, and then move. Confidence is not something you must possess before you begin. It is something you build by beginning. Every meaningful step tells your mind that you are more capable than hesitation suggested. Every challenge you face expands your reference point. Every time you follow through, you earn a little more of your own trust. Eventually, the question changes. Instead of asking, "Am I ready?" you begin asking, "What is the next move?" That is where confidence starts to become real. You do not need certainty to take the first step. You need enough courage to take it and enough persistence to discover what the step can teach you. Chapter 2. Rewrite the story in your head. Long before a person changes a decision, a career, a relationship, or a direction in life, something usually changes inside the private conversation they have with themselves. There is a voice that interprets every setback, explains every mistake, predicts every possibility, and quietly decides what feels realistic. That voice can become an invisible architect. It can construct confidence from ordinary experiences, or it can build walls around potential before the world ever gets a chance to test it. The most dangerous stories are not always dramatic. Sometimes they sound perfectly reasonable. I'm not that kind of person. I've never been good at this. People like me don't succeed at things like that. Or, I'm probably going to fail anyway. Repeated often enough, these statements stop sounding like opinions and begin to feel like facts. But a thought is not automatically a truth simply because it has been repeated for years. One of the most important steps toward confidence is learning to separate what happened from what you decided it meant. A failed interview is an event. I am not good enough is an interpretation. A rejected idea is an event. Nobody will ever take me seriously is an interpretation. A difficult presentation is an experience. I am terrible at speaking is an identity statement. The distinction may appear subtle, but it can redirect an entire life. Consider the journey of J.K. Rowling before the world knew her as the author of the Harry Potter series. Before her books became a global phenomenon, she experienced a period of considerable personal and professional difficulty. She was a single mother, living with financial hardship, and her early manuscript faced rejection from publishers. It would have been easy to interpret those circumstances as proof that her ambition was unrealistic. Rejection can make a person question not only an idea, but also the identity behind the idea. Yet she continued to pursue publication. Her story is not valuable because rejection magically disappeared or because persistence guarantees success. It is valuable because her circumstances did not become the final definition of what she was capable of creating. The lesson is broader than writing books. A person can encounter failure without turning failure into an identity. That distinction is essential because identity influences behavior. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you are shy, you may begin avoiding conversations. If you describe yourself as bad with money, you may stop learning about finances. If you decide that you are not leadership material, you may decline opportunities that would have developed your leadership skills. The label creates the expectation influences the behavior, and the behavior eventually appears to confirm the label. This is how a story can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The mind likes consistency. Once it forms a belief about who you are, it tends to notice evidence that supports the belief and overlook evidence that challenges it. If you believe you are incapable, one mistake can become enormous, while 10 successful attempts barely register. If you believe you are capable of learning, the same mistake becomes information. This does not mean you should replace every negative thought with exaggerated positivity. Telling yourself, "I am the greatest person alive," when you are struggling, may feel artificial rather than empowering. A stronger approach is to make your internal language more accurate. Instead of saying, "I can't do this," say, "I haven't learned how to do this yet." Instead of, "I always fail," say, "This attempt did not work." Instead of, "I'm not confident," say, "I'm learning to act with more confidence." The word "yet" can sometimes open a door that "never" has already closed. Reframing is not pretending that difficulties are pleasant. It is refusing to give difficulties a larger meaning than they deserve. There is a significant difference between acknowledging a weakness and surrendering to it. You might genuinely lack a skill today. That is information, not a life sentence. You might struggle with public speaking, negotiation, leadership, discipline, or social confidence. None of those difficulties automatically define your permanent capacity. Skills can be developed, habits can be changed, perceptions can be examined, even long-held assumptions can be challenged when new evidence begins to accumulate. This is where your internal dialogue becomes important. Pay attention to the language you use after something goes wrong. Do you immediately attack yourself? Do you catastrophize? Do you turn one mistake into a prediction about your entire future? Do you talk yourself out of another attempt before you have even recovered from the first one? A harsh internal voice can masquerade as realism, but constant self-criticism rarely produces better performance. It often produces hesitation, avoidance, and anxiety about making another mistake. A constructive inner voice does something different. It asks, what happened? What can I learn? What can I change? What should I try next? That voice does not excuse failure. It turns failure into usable information. Confidence grows when your mind becomes a place where mistakes can be examined without becoming personal verdicts. Think about someone who has failed several job interviews. The insecure interpretation is, I'm simply not good enough. The stronger interpretation is, something about my preparation, communication, experience, or approach needs improvement. The first conclusion closes the investigation. The second begins it. One produces resignation, the other creates possibility. This is why you must become careful about the stories you carry forward. Some were written by childhood criticism. Some came from one embarrassing experience. Some came from comparison. Others were inherited from people who were afraid themselves. You may have been told that you were too quiet, too ambitious, too sensitive, too ordinary, too inexperienced, or not talented enough. Perhaps those words affected you deeply, but someone else's judgment does not automatically become your destiny. You are allowed to revise the narrative. You are allowed to outgrow an old description of yourself. You are allowed to become unfamiliar to the version of you that once played everything safe. The goal is not to create a fictional identity. It is to develop a more flexible and evidence-based understanding of yourself. You can be nervous and still be capable. You can fail and still be competent. You can lack experience and still be worth listening to. You can make a mistake without becoming a mistake. These distinctions create psychological room to grow. Eventually, confidence begins to sound less like, I know I will win, and more like, I trust myself to learn, adapt, and keep going. That is a far stronger belief because it does not depend on perfect outcomes. You are no longer asking your future to prove that you are worthy before you take action. You are giving yourself permission to develop through action. The story in your head will never control every event in your life, but it can influence what you notice, what you attempt, what you avoid, and how quickly you recover. Rewrite it carefully, not with fantasy, but with honesty. Not with empty praise, but with possibility. Not by pretending you have no weaknesses, but by refusing to mistake your current limitations for your final identity. The words you repeat become the lens through which you interpret your life, and the lens can determine what you are willing to see. Change the interpretation, and you may begin to change the behavior. Change the behavior, and you create new evidence. Create enough new evidence, and eventually you may look back and realize that the person you once described as not capable was simply a person who had not yet discovered what was possible. Chapter 3. Do things that make you uncomfortable. Comfort rarely announces itself as a problem. It usually arrives disguised as convenience, caution, or common sense. You tell yourself that you will speak up when you know more, apply when your experience is stronger, start the project when life becomes less complicated, or take the opportunity when you feel more confident. Nothing seems wrong with the decision because there is no obvious failure. Yet beneath the surface, something important is happening. Every time you automatically step away from discomfort, you teach yourself that discomfort is something to escape rather than something you can handle. Over time, the world you are willing to enter becomes smaller. Confidence grows differently. It develops when you repeatedly discover that an uncomfortable situation is not necessarily an unbearable one. You walk into the conversation you have been avoiding, make the presentation even though your stomach is tight, introduce yourself to someone unfamiliar, ask for an opportunity, receive criticism without falling apart, or attempt something at which you might look inexperienced. Each experience leaves behind a quiet piece of evidence. I survived that. I learned something. I can do it again. This is one reason the career of Michael Jordan offers such a powerful lesson about confidence and discomfort. Jordan became one of the most celebrated basketball players in history, yet his path was not built from effortless victories. As a high school student, he famously experienced the disappointment of not making the varsity basketball team during his sophomore year. The story has often been simplified into a motivational slogan, but the more important lesson is what came afterward. Instead of treating that disappointment as a final verdict on his ability, he continued practicing and developing his game. He used the experience as fuel for improvement. The rejection did not automatically make him confident. The work that followed helped create the confidence. That distinction matters. A setback can either become a reason to retreat or an invitation to expand your capacity. Jordan's story is not evidence that everyone who works hard will become extraordinary. It is evidence that discomfort can become useful when you refuse to let it define your limits. The same principle applies far beyond sports. Think about the first time you entered a room where you knew nobody. Perhaps your instinct was to stay quiet, look at your phone, and wait for someone else to begin the conversation. That choice might have reduced your anxiety immediately. But what did it teach you? It taught you that silence was safer. Now consider another response. You introduce yourself, ask a simple question, and endure the awkwardness of those first few seconds. Nothing dramatic happens. You may stumble over your words. The other person may not seem particularly interested. Perhaps the conversation ends quickly. Yet something valuable has happened. You have expanded your evidence of what you can handle. Confidence is often built in these unremarkable moments. We tend to search for dramatic transformations, but self-trust is frequently constructed through ordinary acts of courage repeated over time. This is why the comfort zone can become so deceptive. Comfort itself is not the enemy. Rest, stability, familiarity, and recovery are essential parts of a healthy life. The problem begins when comfort becomes the only environment in which you are willing to operate. If every unfamiliar situation is treated as a threat, your mind learns to associate growth with danger. You begin to back away before your ability has a chance to develop. Avoidance then becomes a habit, and the habit begins to look like personality. You might say, "I'm just not a public person," when what you really mean is, "I have not practiced being comfortable in public situations." You might say, "I hate confrontation," when perhaps the deeper issue is that you have never learned how to disagree without feeling responsible for everyone else's emotions. You might say, "I'm not ambitious," when part of you may simply be afraid of being judged if you try and fail. These distinctions are worth examining because discomfort and danger are not the same thing. Walking into a genuinely unsafe environment is not courageous merely because it is frightening. Confidence requires judgment. The purpose of discomfort is not to make you reckless, it is to make you more capable. Productive discomfort stretches your abilities without abandoning reason. It might mean volunteering to lead a meeting, asking your manager for feedback, negotiating a salary, joining a new community, learning a difficult skill, sharing your work publicly, or setting a boundary with someone who has become accustomed to your silence. None of these actions guarantee success. That is precisely why they can be valuable. If you only do things when success is certain, you will spend much of your life choosing tasks that require very little courage. Growth demands some exposure to uncertainty. The first attempt will often feel awkward. That is normal. Your brain is encountering something unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity can trigger resistance. The temptation is to interpret nervousness as evidence that you should stop. But nervousness can simply mean that the situation matters and that you have not yet developed familiarity with it. A person who speaks publicly for the 100th time may experience a completely different internal reaction from someone doing it for the first time. The difference is not necessarily personality, it is exposure. Repeated contact changes perception. What once felt enormous becomes manageable. What once required intense preparation becomes routine. What once threatened your identity becomes another ordinary part of your life. This is how you push through psychological barriers without needing to destroy them all at once. You can start small. If speaking to a room of 50 people feels overwhelming, speak in front of 3. If asking for a major opportunity feels impossible, ask for a smaller one first. If you fear criticism, deliberately expose yourself to useful feedback and learn not to treat every uncomfortable opinion as a personal attack. The objective is not to overwhelm yourself. It is to gradually stretch the boundaries of what you believe you can handle. Each time you do, you strengthen your internal capacity. Eventually, you begin to understand something that fear rarely tells you. Discomfort has an expiration date. The tension before a difficult conversation is temporary. The embarrassment after a mistake fades. The nervousness before a presentation eventually gives way to the presentation itself. The uncertainty surrounding a new challenge becomes clearer once you begin moving through it. Avoidance offers immediate relief, but courage offers long-term freedom. This is why deliberately choosing manageable discomfort can transform confidence. You stop organizing your life around the question, how can I avoid feeling uncomfortable, and begin asking, what kind of discomfort is worth experiencing for the person I want to become? That question changes everything. It reframes discomfort from an enemy into a cost of expansion. Every meaningful ambition carries some version of that cost. A better career may require uncomfortable conversations. Stronger relationships may require vulnerability. Leadership may require decisions that disappoint people. Creativity may require showing unfinished work. Personal growth may require admitting that an old belief no longer serves you. You cannot remove all of these experiences without removing many of the opportunities attached to them. The person who becomes confident is not necessarily the person who feels comfortable everywhere. It is the person who has learned that discomfort does not automatically mean stop. Sometimes it means keep going carefully. Sometimes it means learn. Sometimes it means adapt. And sometimes it means this matters. The goal is not to build a life in which nothing intimidates you. The goal is to build a character that can remain steady when something does. When you repeatedly step outside what is familiar, you begin to discover that your limits were not always walls. Some were simply lines you had never crossed. Cross them thoughtfully. Stretch your capacity. Stand your ground when it matters. Take on challenges that make you question yourself without allowing that question to become a verdict. Confidence is not created by making the world less demanding. It is created by becoming more capable of meeting the demands that matter. The more evidence you collect that you can face discomfort, learn from it, and move forward, the less power fear has over your decisions. Eventually, you realize that the life you wanted was not waiting in a perfectly comfortable place. It was waiting beyond a series of uncomfortable moments you once believed you could not handle. Chapter 4. Stop needing everyone's approval. There is a peculiar audience that follows you everywhere, even when nobody is watching. It sits quietly in your mind while you choose a career, write a message, express an opinion, buy something, change your appearance, start a project, or consider taking a risk. You may never see this audience, yet you can feel its influence in the smallest decisions. What will they think? Will they approve? Will they understand? Will they judge me if this fails? The desire to be accepted is deeply human, but when approval becomes the hidden condition for every decision, confidence begins to erode. You stop asking what you believe and start asking what will be easiest for others to accept. You stop following your judgment and start managing other people's reactions. Eventually, you can become remarkably skilled at living a life that makes sense to everyone except yourself. Confidence requires something different: the ability to listen without surrendering your judgment. This does not mean becoming stubborn, insensitive, or indifferent to useful criticism. It means developing enough inner stability to distinguish between feedback that can improve you and approval that merely makes you feel temporarily safe. Consider how easily this problem appears in ordinary life. Someone receives an opportunity to move into a new role but turns it down because friends say it sounds too demanding. Another person wants to start a business but keeps delaying because relatives believe a traditional career would be safer. Someone wants to speak honestly in a meeting but remains silent because they fear appearing difficult. Another person chooses a relationship, lifestyle, or career path primarily because it looks impressive from the outside. None of these decisions necessarily appears dramatic. That is what makes approval seeking so powerful. It can influence a life without ever announcing itself as fear. Sometimes the strongest pressure does not come from people telling you what to do. It comes from your anticipation of what they might say. Social media has intensified this tendency by turning approval into something that can be measured. A photograph receives likes, an opinion receives comments. A professional achievement receives public recognition. A person can begin to confuse visibility with value and popularity with truth. When external validation becomes the scoreboard, silence can feel like failure, and disagreement can feel like rejection. The result is a subtle form of self-censorship. You begin to edit yourself before anyone else has even spoken. Confidence requires breaking away from that pattern. One of the most important distinctions you can make is between being respected and being universally approved. These are not the same thing. A person who constantly changes position to avoid disagreement may receive approval in the short term, but that does not necessarily create respect. In fact, people often trust individuals who can express a clear position while remaining open to discussion. Conviction does not require hostility. You can say, "I see this differently," without declaring that everyone else is foolish. You can say no without insulting the person making the request. You can accept criticism without accepting every criticism as truth. You can change your mind because evidence changed, not because someone pressured you into surrendering your judgment. That is discernment. It is one of the quiet foundations of mature confidence. The ability to evaluate opinions rather than automatically absorb them gives you something valuable: autonomy. Autonomy does not mean refusing advice. It means remaining responsible for your final decision. Think about the difference between asking, "What do you think I should do?" and asking, "What am I missing before I make this decision?" The first question can hand your authority to someone else. The second invites perspective while keeping responsibility in your own hands. That difference may seem small, but it reveals a major shift in mindset. You are no longer looking for someone to make you certain. You are gathering information so you can make a better judgment. This becomes especially important when your goals require you to do something unfamiliar. If you depend heavily on approval, every ambitious step becomes emotionally expensive. You may need everyone around you to understand your decision before you feel comfortable making it. But meaningful choices are rarely accompanied by universal agreement. Someone will think you are moving too quickly. Someone else will think you are moving too slowly. One person will say you are too ambitious. Another will say you are not ambitious enough. If you build your identity around satisfying every opinion, you will spend your life chasing a target that keeps moving. There is also a deeper reason approval can weaken confidence. It prevents you from discovering whether you can trust yourself. If every important decision is repeatedly outsourced to friends, colleagues, family members, or strangers online, you never give your own judgment enough opportunities to mature. You may become dependent on reassurance. Before sending an email, you ask someone to read it. Before making a decision, you seek 5 opinions. Before trying something new, you search for evidence that everyone else thinks it is a good idea. Advice can be useful, but constant reassurance can become a psychological crutch. The more you rely on it, the harder independent action feels. Self-trust develops through responsible decision-making. You gather information, weigh the consequences, consider the people affected, listen to credible feedback, and then decide. Sometimes you will be wrong. That is part of the process. A confident person is not someone who makes perfect decisions. A confident person can make an imperfect decision, recognize the mistake, and adjust without collapsing into self-doubt. This is why criticism should not automatically be brushed off. Some criticism contains valuable information. A colleague may point out a flaw in your presentation. A friend may notice a behavior you have overlooked. A customer may identify a weakness in your product. The confident response is not, "Nobody can tell me anything." That is arrogance disguised as strength. The confident response is, "Let me examine this. If there is something useful here, I will use it." That mindset allows you to remain teachable without becoming dependent. There will also be moments when people criticize you simply because your choices make them uncomfortable. Your growth can disturb the expectations others have built around you. When you begin setting boundaries, someone may accuse you of changing. When you become more ambitious, someone may call you unrealistic. When you become less available for unnecessary drama, someone may say you have become distant. Not every negative reaction is evidence that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes it is simply evidence that you are no longer behaving according to an old expectation. Learning to tolerate being misunderstood is part of becoming confident. You do not need to launch a campaign defending every decision you make. You can allow some people to misunderstand you without immediately trying to correct their perception. That is not weakness. It is emotional restraint. Your life cannot be governed entirely by the opinions of people who will not live with the consequences of your choices. This does not give you permission to ignore responsibility or behave carelessly. It means you must decide whose opinions deserve weight. A stranger's comment may be emotionally loud but intellectually irrelevant. A trusted mentor's criticism may be uncomfortable but enormously valuable. A close friend's concern may deserve careful consideration. A random online reaction may deserve almost none. Confidence requires knowing the difference. The more clearly you understand your values, the easier this becomes. When you know what matters to you, every opinion does not carry equal weight. You can ask yourself, does this criticism help me become better, or does it simply make me feel smaller? That question can help you separate growth from people-pleasing. There is tremendous freedom in realizing that you can disappoint someone and still be a good person. You can say no and still be kind. You can disagree and still be respectful. You can choose a different path and still appreciate the people who would have chosen another one. You can listen carefully without giving away your authority. This is what mature confidence looks like. It is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It is the quiet ability to stand up for your values without needing to turn every disagreement into a battle. Eventually, you begin to understand that confidence grows when your decisions are guided by conviction rather than controlled by reaction. You stop living as if every choice requires a public vote. You stop shrinking your ambitions to make other people comfortable. You stop giving temporary criticism the power to determine permanent decisions. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to hear your own judgment again. The goal is not to become someone who never cares what others think. The goal is to become someone who can care without being controlled. Because when you no longer need everyone to approve of your direction, you finally have the freedom to choose a direction that is truly yours. Chapter 5. Speak like you believe yourself. Confidence can often be heard before it is seen. It appears in the way a person pauses before answering, the steadiness of a voice, the willingness to finish a sentence without apologizing for having an opinion, and the ability to remain composed when someone disagrees. None of this requires a commanding personality or a naturally powerful voice. In fact, some of the most confident people are remarkably calm. They do not compete for attention because they are not desperately trying to prove that they deserve it. Their words carry weight because their minds are not constantly negotiating with themselves about whether they are allowed to speak. Communication reveals what confidence feels like on the inside. When you doubt yourself, your language often begins to retreat before your ideas have even been heard. You say, "I'm not sure, but maybe we could possibly try," when what you actually mean is, "I think this approach could work." You apologize before expressing a reasonable request. You explain a simple decision with 5 unnecessary sentences because you are afraid someone might disagree. You speak rapidly because silence feels uncomfortable. You soften every opinion until nobody can tell what you actually believe. These habits may appear harmless, but repeated over time, they can weaken both how others perceive you and how you perceive yourself. The solution is not to become aggressive. Confidence is not volume, dominance, or the ability to win every argument. It is clarity without hostility, assertiveness without arrogance, and conviction without the need to control everyone in the room. A confident communicator understands that being direct and being disrespectful are completely different things. You can disagree without attacking. You can refuse without insulting. You can ask for more without feeling guilty. You can acknowledge that you might be wrong without speaking as though your entire position is worthless. This balance is one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity. Consider a simple workplace conversation. Your manager asks whether you can take on another task, but your schedule is already overloaded. An approval-seeking response might be, "I'm really sorry, I know everyone is busy, and I don't want to make things difficult, but I guess I can probably try." You may believe you are being helpful, but you have actually failed to communicate your capacity. A more confident response might be, "I can take this on, but I'll need to move the other deadline. Which priority should come first?" The second response is not rude, it is precise. It respects both your responsibilities and the organization's needs. Confidence frequently sounds like that, simple, measured, and clear. One of the most valuable habits you can develop is learning to pause. Nervousness often makes people rush through their words because they want the uncomfortable moment to end. But a pause can communicate something completely different. It suggests that you are thinking rather than reacting. You do not need to fill every silence. You do not need to answer instantly to prove that you are intelligent. Sometimes the strongest response is the one that arrives after a moment of consideration. Slowing down also helps you get your message across more effectively. When you speak too quickly, important ideas can become tangled, emotional, or difficult to follow. A deliberate pace gives your words room to land. This does not mean speaking artificially slowly or adopting someone else's personality. It means becoming comfortable enough with your own presence that you no longer feel compelled to rush through it. Your physical behavior matters as well. Posture, eye contact, facial expression, and movement can influence communication, but they should not be treated as tricks for pretending to be confident. The deeper goal is congruence. When your words say one thing while your body communicates fear, people often sense the conflict. You say, "I'm comfortable with this decision," while constantly looking down, fidgeting, or nervously laughing. The answer is not to memorize a performance. It is to become more internally aligned with what you are saying. When you know why you believe something, your communication becomes more natural. That is why preparation can strengthen confidence. If you are speaking about a subject you understand, you do not need to decorate every sentence with complicated language. You can explain the idea simply because you understand it clearly. Precision becomes more persuasive than complexity. Advanced vocabulary has its place, but sophisticated communication is not about sounding intelligent. It is about making your meaning difficult to misunderstand. Another important part of confident communication is learning to say no. Many people struggle with this because they associate refusal with rejection. They believe that if they decline a request, someone will become disappointed, angry, or distant, so they say yes when they mean no, then carry the resentment and exhaustion that follow. A clear no can actually be more respectful than an unwilling yes. You might say, "I'm not able to take that on right now," or "that doesn't work for me." You do not always need a lengthy justification. When you constantly over-explain your boundaries, you can accidentally communicate that your boundary requires permission to exist. It does not. Of course, there are situations where context matters and kindness matters too. Confidence is not an excuse to become dismissive, but respect should move in both directions. Your time, energy, priorities, and limits deserve consideration. The same principle applies when you disagree. A confident person can say, "I see the situation differently," without turning the conversation into a contest. They can listen carefully, ask questions, and change their position when better evidence appears. That ability is often overlooked. People sometimes confuse confidence with stubbornness, but stubbornness can come from insecurity. If your identity depends on always being right, every disagreement becomes a threat. Genuine confidence gives you enough psychological room to admit, "I was wrong," without feeling that you have become less valuable. In fact, the willingness to correct yourself can increase credibility. People trust communicators who are willing to acknowledge reality more than those who defend every statement simply to protect their image. There is also power in speaking up when silence would be easier. Perhaps you have an idea at work but hesitate because someone more experienced is present. Perhaps you need to ask a difficult question. Perhaps someone has crossed a boundary and you keep hoping the situation will resolve itself. Each time you hold back unnecessarily, you send yourself a message about your own voice. Each time you speak with honesty and composure, you send a different message. What I think matters enough to express. That does not mean every thought deserves to be spoken. Wisdom includes restraint. Confidence is not having something to say about everything. It is knowing when to speak, what to say, and when silence is more useful. The objective is not to become the loudest person in the room. It is to become someone whose presence does not disappear when the room becomes difficult. Your voice should not need to sound fearless to be valuable. Your hands may shake, your heart may race. You may still feel uncertain. Speak anyway when the situation requires it. Confidence is not a perfect performance. It is the decision to remain present while imperfection is visible. Eventually, you stop measuring your communication by whether everyone approves of it. You begin measuring it by whether you expressed yourself honestly, clearly, and respectfully. That shift is liberating. You no longer spend every conversation trying to manage how you are perceived. You focus on what you actually want to communicate. You become more willing to ask, clarify, challenge, negotiate, refuse, and contribute. Your language becomes cleaner because your thinking becomes clearer, and your confidence grows because every honest conversation gives you another piece of evidence that you can stand behind your own words. You do not need to sound powerful to become powerful. You need to stop abandoning your voice whenever you feel uncertain. Speak with clarity. Listen with humility. Stand by what you genuinely believe and remain open enough to revise it when the truth demands it. When you learn to communicate from that position, your voice stops asking for permission and starts carrying conviction. Chapter 6. Become comfortable with rejection. A single word can sometimes feel heavier than an entire conversation. No, it can close a door, interrupt an ambition, end an opportunity, or leave a person staring at a message long after it has been read. Rejection has a strange ability to turn a temporary event into a permanent story. Someone declines your proposal, and suddenly you wonder whether your ideas are worthless. An employer chooses another candidate, and you begin questioning your entire career. Someone you care about does not return your feelings, and your mind quietly converts one person's decision into a judgment about your value. The painful part of rejection is rarely the word itself. It is the meaning we attach to it. That is why confident people are not necessarily people who experience less rejection. They are people who have learned not to let rejection become an identity. They understand that "they rejected my proposal" and "they rejected me" are not the same sentence, even though the mind often treats them as if they were. The first describes an event. The second creates a verdict. That distinction can protect your confidence when circumstances do not go your way. Consider the career of Walt Disney, whose early professional life included setbacks and rejection before he became one of the most recognizable names in entertainment. Early in his career, he faced difficulties with business ventures and experienced setbacks that could have persuaded him to abandon animation altogether. One frequently repeated story claims that he was fired from a newspaper because he supposedly lacked creativity, but that particular version has been difficult to verify reliably, so it is wiser not to build the lesson around it as established fact. What is well supported is that Disney experienced serious financial and professional setbacks, including the collapse of his early animation company and the loss of rights to a character he had helped create. Those experiences were not minor disappointments. They represented genuine threats to his ambitions. Yet he continued to develop new ideas, rebuild, and pursue opportunities. His story demonstrates something more useful than the myth of effortless success. Rejection and failure can interrupt a direction without necessarily ending the destination. This matters because people often make rejection larger than it needs to be. A no becomes never. A failed attempt becomes "I am incapable." A missed opportunity becomes "there will not be another one." The mind tries to create certainty from uncertainty, and negative certainty can feel strangely safer than possibility. If you decide in advance that you will fail again, you no longer have to risk disappointment. But you also no longer have to discover what might have happened if you had tried again. Confidence requires breaking that pattern. Rejection is information, but information is useful only when you are willing to examine it. If a company rejects your application, perhaps another candidate had stronger experience. Perhaps your resume needs improvement. Perhaps the position was never a strong match. If a client rejects your proposal, perhaps the price, timing, presentation, or offer needs to change. If someone refuses your request, perhaps their circumstances have nothing to do with your worth. The point is not to manufacture a comforting explanation for every rejection. The point is to investigate rather than automatically condemn yourself. A confident person asks, "What can I learn from this?" before asking, "What does this say about me?" That question creates distance between the event and your identity. It also gives you something to work with. Imagine two people applying for the same opportunity. Both receive a rejection. The first says, "I knew I wasn't good enough," and stops applying. The second says, "That didn't work. What can I improve before the next attempt?" The external event is identical. The internal interpretation is completely different. One person turns rejection into a ceiling. The other turns it into feedback. Over time, their lives will diverge, not because one person experiences no disappointment, but because one continues to move while the other withdraws. This is why rejection tolerance is such a valuable form of confidence. You do not build it by convincing yourself that rejection does not hurt. Of course it can hurt. You build it by learning that discomfort is survivable. You apply again. You make another proposal. You ask another question. You submit another piece of work. You enter another conversation. Gradually, the emotional weight of no begins to change. It still matters, but it no longer controls you. The first rejection can feel like a disaster. The 10th may feel like information. The 20th may simply become part of the process. This does not mean you should endlessly pursue something that clearly does not fit. Confidence includes discernment. Sometimes rejection is a signal to change direction, improve your approach, or walk away. Persistence without judgment can become stubbornness. The goal is not to chase every closed door. The goal is to become psychologically strong enough to distinguish between a door that should be left behind and a door that deserves another knock. That requires emotional detachment, not emotional numbness. Detachment means you can care deeply about an outcome without allowing the outcome to determine your entire sense of worth. An entrepreneur can care about a business and still recognize when the model needs to change. An artist can care about their work and still accept that not everyone will appreciate it. A professional can care about promotion and still understand that one decision does not define an entire career. A person can care about being loved and still accept that one person's inability to return that love does not make them unlovable. These distinctions create resilience. Rejection also becomes less frightening when you stop treating it as the opposite of success. Often, rejection is part of the path toward success because meaningful attempts naturally produce uncertain outcomes. If you apply for one job, one school, one grant, one contract, or one opportunity, you are making yourself dependent on a single decision. But if you continue to create opportunities, rejection becomes one result among many rather than the final judgment. This is why confident people often appear persistent. They are not necessarily more optimistic than everyone else. They have simply learned to keep moving after disappointment. They bounce back because they do not interpret every setback as a command to stop. There is another subtle benefit to becoming comfortable with rejection. You become more willing to ask for what you actually want. You negotiate instead of accepting the first offer. You pitch an idea instead of keeping it private. You ask for feedback instead of avoiding criticism. You pursue relationships that matter. You raise your hand when opportunities appear. You become more willing to hear no because you understand that a no is sometimes the price of discovering a yes. The person who is terrified of rejection often chooses safety over possibility. The person who can tolerate rejection gains access to possibilities that fear would have eliminated before the attempt even began. That is one of the hidden powers of confidence. It expands the number of things you are willing to try. Eventually, rejection loses some of its ability to define the moment. You stop thinking, "What if they say no?" and start thinking, "If they say no, I will decide what to do next." That is a profound shift. You are no longer demanding certainty from the world before you act. You are trusting yourself to respond to whatever happens. That is real self-trust. You cannot control every decision made by employers, customers, audiences, partners, institutions, or strangers. You can control whether rejection becomes a dead end or a data point. You can decide whether to learn, adapt, move on, try again, or pursue something better. The world will say no to you sometimes. It will misunderstand you, overlook you, disappoint you, and occasionally close doors you desperately wanted opened. None of that gives the world permanent authority over your identity. A rejection can change your direction without defining your destination. So do not build a life around avoiding the word no. Build a life in which no is survivable. Let rejection sharpen your judgment rather than shrink your ambition. Let it teach you without becoming your teacher forever. Because once you realize that you can withstand disappointment, recover your composure, and move forward, rejection loses its greatest weapon. It can close a door, but it no longer has the power to convince you that there are no other doors worth opening. Chapter 7. Keep promises to yourself. Some of the most important promises you will ever make are never spoken aloud. They are made quietly, usually at the end of a disappointing day, when you tell yourself that tomorrow will be different. You will wake up earlier, you will finish the project, you will exercise, you will stop procrastinating. You will finally apply for the opportunity you have been avoiding. Nobody else hears these promises, so nobody else can easily measure whether you keep them. Yet your mind keeps score. Every time you make a commitment to yourself and follow through, you strengthen something deeper than discipline. You strengthen self-trust. And every time you repeatedly break your own commitments, something equally important begins to weaken. You start becoming uncertain about your own word. This is why confidence is not built only through impressive achievements. It is built through private evidence. A person who consistently does what they said they would do begins to develop a quiet certainty. I can count on myself. That belief is more durable than temporary motivation because it is supported by experience. Think about the difference between confidence based on praise and confidence based on self-trust. Praise depends on an audience. Self-trust does not. Someone can compliment your intelligence, appearance, performance, or talent, but their opinion can change tomorrow. Your own record of behavior is harder to dismiss. When you repeatedly show up for yourself, you create credibility with the one person whose confidence matters every day. You. This is why small commitments can have enormous psychological value. Suppose you decide that you will exercise for an hour every morning, read 50 pages every night, build a business after work, and completely transform your lifestyle within a month. The ambition may sound impressive, but if the plan is unrealistic, repeated failure can teach your mind the wrong lesson. You begin another week with enthusiasm, fall behind, feel disappointed, abandon the plan, and eventually tell yourself that you lack discipline. The problem may not be your character. The problem may be that you created a promise you could not reasonably keep. A better approach is to build reliability through commitments that are demanding enough to matter, but realistic enough to complete. 10 minutes of exercise that you actually do can be more valuable for self-trust than an hour-long routine you abandon after 3 days. 1 page written every day can become a manuscript. 1 difficult conversation can repair a relationship. 1 application submitted can open a door. Confidence grows through accumulated evidence, and evidence requires consistency. This is where discipline becomes more meaningful than motivation. Motivation is often emotional. It rises and falls with sleep, stress, excitement, disappointment, and circumstance. Discipline is the decision to follow through even when the emotional reward is absent. You do not need to feel inspired to keep a promise. In fact, keeping commitments when you do not feel inspired is one of the clearest ways to strengthen your confidence. Every time you follow through despite inconvenience, you reinforce the idea that your actions are not completely controlled by your mood. This does not mean forcing yourself through every situation, regardless of circumstances. Mature discipline includes flexibility. Sometimes you need to rest, change the plan or acknowledge that a commitment no longer makes sense. The goal is not blind obedience to old promises. The goal is becoming someone who takes their own commitments seriously. There is a profound difference between saying, "I should do this," and saying, "I decided to do this." The first creates vague intention, the second creates responsibility. Once you decide, the question becomes whether you will follow through. This principle applies far beyond productivity. Imagine telling yourself that you will stop accepting disrespect, but continuing to tolerate the same behavior because confrontation feels uncomfortable. Imagine promising yourself that you will pursue a better career, but repeatedly refusing to update your skills because learning something new feels inconvenient. Imagine deciding that your financial future matters, but continually spending without examining where your money goes. Each contradiction creates friction between the person you claim you want to become and the behavior you repeatedly demonstrate. That friction can quietly damage self-respect. On the other hand, when your actions begin matching your intentions, something changes. You become more internally aligned. You do not have to constantly convince yourself that you are disciplined because your behavior provides the evidence. This is one reason successful people often appear confident even when they are not naturally charismatic. Their confidence may come from knowing that they have developed a history of following through. They have faced difficult mornings, uncomfortable decisions, failed attempts, and periods when motivation disappeared, yet they continued. Their confidence is not built entirely on what they hope to do. It is built on what they have already proved to themselves. The concept of self-credibility is especially powerful here. Think about credibility in professional life. A person becomes trusted because their actions consistently match their words. If they promise to deliver something and repeatedly deliver it, people begin to rely on them. If they constantly make commitments and fail to honor them, trust deteriorates. Your relationship with yourself works in much the same way. Every promise you keep is a small deposit into your internal account of credibility. Every broken promise is a withdrawal. One missed commitment does not destroy confidence. Life is unpredictable and perfection is impossible. The problem is the pattern of making promises casually and breaking them routinely. Eventually, your mind stops taking your intentions seriously. That is why consistency matters more than intensity. You do not need dramatic declarations about how your life will change. You need repeated evidence that you can act according to your decisions. Perhaps you decide to spend 30 minutes each evening learning a valuable skill. At first, the change may seem insignificant, but after several months, the accumulated hours become substantial. More importantly, you have developed an identity around follow-through. You become someone who learns even when nobody is forcing you. You begin to trust yourself in other areas because you have evidence from one area. This is how confidence spreads. A promise kept in one part of your life can strengthen your willingness to act in another. There is also a powerful connection between self-trust and boundaries. When you know you will honor your own decisions, you become less dependent on other people to protect your priorities. You can say no because you trust yourself to tolerate someone's disappointment. You can leave situations that undermine you because you trust yourself to handle the uncertainty that follows. You can pursue a difficult goal because you trust yourself to continue when the excitement fades. Self-trust gives you psychological leverage. It reduces the fear of what might happen if you stop pleasing everyone else. But keeping promises to yourself does not mean becoming rigid. Life will interrupt your plans. Illness, family responsibilities, unexpected opportunities, changing priorities, and genuine exhaustion can require adjustment. Confidence means being able to revise a commitment intelligently without using flexibility as an excuse for chronic avoidance. Ask yourself whether you are adapting because circumstances genuinely changed or because discomfort appeared. That distinction matters. Sometimes the right decision is to change course. Sometimes it is to keep going. The more honest you become with yourself, the better you become at knowing the difference. Ultimately, confidence is not simply the feeling that you are capable. It is the knowledge that you will make an effort, learn from mistakes, and follow through on what matters. You become more secure when your words and actions stop fighting each other. You no longer need constant external motivation because your own standards begin to guide you. You no longer wonder whether you can trust yourself because you have built a history that answers the question. The most powerful promise is not, "I will never fail." It is, "I will not abandon myself when I do." Keep the commitments that matter. Follow through when the excitement fades. Show up when nobody is watching. Adjust when necessary, but do not casually betray your own decisions. Because every time you keep a meaningful promise to yourself, you are doing more than completing a task. You are teaching yourself that your word has weight. And when you truly believe that you can count on yourself, confidence stops being something you perform for the world. It becomes something you carry within you. Chapter 8. Act before your fear disappears. Fear often arrives before clarity. It appears when the decision matters, when the outcome is uncertain, and when there is something meaningful to lose. The natural response is to wait. We tell ourselves that we will act when we feel calmer, more certain, more prepared, or more confident. But there is a problem with that strategy. Fear does not always disappear simply because you give it more time. Sometimes, the longer you wait, the more convincing it becomes. What began as a reasonable concern can grow into a collection of imagined disasters, each one providing another excuse to remain still. Confidence requires a different relationship with fear. It does not demand that fear vanish before action begins. It asks whether the fear deserves the final vote. There is an important distinction between fear and danger. Danger requires caution. Fear requires interpretation. A dark road, an unsafe situation, or a genuinely reckless decision should not be approached simply to prove that you are brave. But fear of rejection, embarrassment, uncertainty, criticism, or failure is often an emotional signal rather than a reliable prediction of what will happen. Learning to distinguish the two is part of becoming courageous. Consider someone who has spent years thinking about changing careers. They have researched the industry, considered the financial implications, spoken to people in the field, and developed a reasonable plan. Yet they continue to delay because the transition feels uncertain. There is no perfect moment. The current job feels secure but unfulfilling, while the new direction feels exciting but unfamiliar. Waiting for complete certainty can keep the person trapped indefinitely, because certainty is precisely what the decision cannot provide. At some point they must weigh the risks, accept the ambiguity, and move forward. This does not mean acting impulsively. It means recognizing when further analysis is no longer producing better judgment, but merely protecting you from discomfort. Overthinking can disguise itself as responsibility. You gather more information, compare more options, ask more people, and create more scenarios. Eventually, you know enough to make a reasonable decision, but you continue searching because choosing would make the uncertainty real. The mind prefers an unresolved possibility to a definite risk. Yet every meaningful choice closes some doors. That is not necessarily a tragedy. It is part of living deliberately. Decisiveness does not mean knowing the future. It means making the best judgment available with the information you currently possess and being willing to adjust when new information appears. This is where calculated risk becomes important. You do not need to leap blindly. You can weigh up the consequences, identify what could go wrong, create safeguards, and then act. Confidence is not the belief that nothing will go wrong. It is the belief that if something does go wrong, you will respond. That belief changes the emotional equation. Instead of asking, "What if I fail?" You begin asking, if I fail, what will I do next? The second question gives you agency. Fear wants to convince you that the outcome will determine your future. Confidence reminds you that your response will also shape it. Many opportunities disappear because people confuse uncertainty with warning. A new position may feel uncertain because you have never held it. Speaking in front of a room may feel frightening because you have not done it often. Asking for an opportunity may feel risky because you cannot control the answer. None of these facts automatically mean you should stop. Sometimes fear is simply the emotional cost of entering unfamiliar territory. You can move forward while still feeling it. You can prepare your notes while your stomach feels tight. You can make the call while your mind predicts rejection. You can submit the application while wondering whether you are qualified enough. The objective is not to silence every fearful thought. It is to stop treating every fearful thought as an instruction. There will always be another reason to postpone. You can wait for next month, more money, more experience, better timing, stronger confidence, or one final piece of information. Eventually, waiting becomes a decision of its own. You are choosing not to move. Sometimes that choice is wise. Sometimes it is simply fear wearing a sophisticated disguise. Learn to recognize the difference. Ask yourself whether you are gathering information or avoiding commitment. Ask whether the risk is genuinely dangerous or merely uncomfortable. Ask whether another hour of thinking will improve your decision or simply make you more anxious. Then, when the answer is clear enough, go ahead. Fear may still be there. Let it come with you. You do not need to defeat it before you begin. You only need to decide that it will not decide everything for you. Courage is not the moment fear disappears. It is the moment you decide that fear does not get the final vote. Chapter 9. Build a presence. People can feel. Some people enter a room and immediately demand attention. Others enter quietly, say little, and somehow make people pay attention anyway. The difference is rarely volume, it is presence. Genuine confidence does not always announce itself. It can be felt in the person who listens without looking distracted, speaks without rushing, remains calm when challenged, and does not constantly search the room for approval. There is a steadiness behind their behavior that suggests they are comfortable occupying their own space. That kind of presence cannot be manufactured through posture alone. It grows from internal security. When you trust yourself, you have less need to perform yourself. You do not need to dominate conversations, exaggerate your achievements, or turn every disagreement into a contest. You can slow down. You can listen. You can think before answering. You can allow silence to exist without immediately filling it. These small behaviors can communicate more confidence than an impressive speech ever could. Consider what happens when someone asks you a difficult question and you do not immediately know the answer. An insecure response might be to talk quickly, change the subject, or pretend to know more than you actually do. A grounded response can be much simpler. I'm not certain. Let me look into it. That sentence does not weaken your credibility. In many situations, it strengthens it because honesty is easier to trust than performance. Confidence gives you enough emotional room to admit what you do not know without feeling that your identity is collapsing. This is especially important in leadership. People rarely need leaders who pretend to have every answer. They need people who can remain composed while uncertainty exists. A calm leader can acknowledge a problem, gather information, make a decision, and adjust when necessary. They do not spread panic simply because circumstances are difficult. Emotional regulation, therefore, becomes an important part of presence. If every criticism triggers defensiveness, every disagreement produces anger, and every setback creates visible panic, other people may begin to doubt your stability. Remaining calm does not mean suppressing emotion. It means refusing to let every emotion take control of your behavior. You can feel frustrated without becoming hostile. You can feel nervous without becoming evasive. You can feel disappointed without losing perspective. That restraint creates quiet authority. Your body also communicates before your words do. Constant fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, speaking too quickly, or shrinking physically can reveal discomfort, but confidence does not require turning yourself into a rigid statue. Instead, focus on being present. Sit or stand naturally. Look at people when they speak. Slow down when you need to think. Let your hands move naturally. Carry yourself as though you have a legitimate right to be where you are. That final idea matters because many people unconsciously apologize for their presence. They enter a conversation already trying to become smaller. They worry about taking too much space, speaking too much, asking too much, or appearing too ambitious. Confidence does not mean taking more space than everyone else. It means not unnecessarily surrendering the space that belongs to you. There is also strength in listening. People who are desperate to appear intelligent often spend conversations preparing their next response instead of understanding what is being said. A confident person can tune in fully. They do not need to prove that they are the smartest person in the room. They can ask a thoughtful question, remain silent for a moment, and allow another person's idea to develop. This creates trust because attention itself is a form of respect. Presence becomes especially powerful when combined with consistency. If your words say you are calm, but your behavior changes dramatically whenever circumstances become inconvenient, people will notice the contradiction. Real presence comes from alignment between what you believe and how you behave. You become dependable under pressure because you have practiced composure when nobody was applauding. You learn to pause instead of reacting. You learn to think before responding. You learn to stand steady when someone challenges your opinion. Over time, these habits become part of your identity rather than techniques you consciously perform. The result is a form of confidence that does not need to compete for attention. You do not have to be the loudest person in the room. You do not need the most impressive story. You do not need everyone to admire you. You simply need enough internal stability to remain fully present. When you build that kind of presence, people begin to notice something different. They may not be able to explain it, but they sense that you are not easily shaken. You are listening. You are thinking. You are comfortable with silence. You can disagree without becoming defensive. You can admit uncertainty without collapsing. You can make a decision without demanding applause afterward. That is quiet authority. And quiet authority is often more powerful than performance because it does not disappear when the attention does. Ultimately, confidence is not about creating an image that impresses people. It is about becoming secure enough that you no longer need to create one. Slow down, tune in, carry yourself with composure. Speak when your words matter and remain silent when they do not. Let your confidence be felt rather than advertised. The strongest presence in the room may not be the person trying hardest to be noticed. It may be the person who no longer needs to be. Conclusion: become the person who believes in you. There comes a point when confidence stops being an idea and becomes a decision. You have seen that confidence is not something reserved for people who were born fearless, naturally charismatic, or unusually gifted. It is built through choices repeated when nobody is watching. You stop waiting to feel ready and begin moving before certainty arrives. You challenge the stories that have quietly limited you. You step into discomfort and discover that nervousness does not mean weakness. You stop allowing other people's approval to determine the direction of your life. You learn to speak with clarity, withstand rejection, keep promises to yourself, act while uncertainty remains, and carry yourself with calm authority. None of these changes require you to become someone else. They require you to become more fully yourself. Real confidence does not promise that you will always win. It gives you something more useful, the belief that you can respond when things do not go your way. You may still hesitate. You may still hear the old voice asking whether you are good enough. You may still feel your heart race before an important decision. The difference is that you no longer have to obey every fearful thought. You can acknowledge uncertainty and move anyway. You can hear criticism without surrendering your judgment. You can experience rejection without turning it into an identity. You can fail without deciding that failure is who you are. This is where confidence becomes transformative. It changes not only how you see yourself, but also what you are willing to attempt, and what you attempt determines what you experience. What you experience expands what you learn. What you learn changes what you believe you can handle. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, your life begins to grow around the person you are becoming. So do not leave this book with nothing more than inspiration. Leave with a decision. There is something you have been postponing, avoiding, shrinking from, or waiting to feel ready for. Perhaps it is a conversation, an application, a business idea, a personal boundary, a creative project, or simply the decision to stop speaking to yourself as though you are incapable. Take one meaningful step toward it. You do not need complete certainty. You need enough courage to begin and enough self-trust to continue. You will encounter fear. You will encounter rejection. You will make mistakes. None of these experiences has the authority to define the size of your future unless you give it that authority. Confidence is not believing that the road ahead will always be easy. It is knowing that you can keep walking when it is not. Be bold enough to try. Be strong enough to continue. Be humble enough to learn. And be confident enough to become the person your future requires. You do not need permission to believe in yourself. Start acting like you do.